Platform Podcast. So we are on episode 34 already of the Web Platform Podcast. We have Karl Groves, who is joining us to talk about Tenon.io. Danny Blue from Deloitte Digital.
Hey, everybody.
Adi Chikara. What's up,
Hello.
Adi? So, Karl, welcome to the Web Platform. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you'll be talking about today?
Sure. My name is Karl Groves. I am a full-time accessibility consultant for the Paciello Group. Paciello Group has people all over the U.S., also U.K., France. I think Hans is in New Zealand now, Canada, and so we do accessibility consulting pretty much solely. And then I also own a company called Tenon.io. We've created a product called Tenon, and it's a automated accessibility testing tool with a little bit different of an approach to things. So that's me.
How is it different than some of the other tools that we might use as web developers?
So one of the things that happens with accessibility testing tools is that they're often employed late in the development cycle, often post-deployment or when we get to like staging or something like that, and that's kind of a difficult place to be for accessibility because that stuff, a lot of that front-end code has already been written. It's already been vetted. Maybe even other unit tests have been run, and there's been design decisions made along the way that could sideline any attempts at remediation. If you try to remediate issues, after they're deployed or right when they're in staging, that's going to be a problem. It's going to cost a lot more money, take a lot more time, just like any other bug. So Tenon, we take an API-first approach, meaning although we have a web-based front end, we actually encourage people to use the API itself. The API, or the front end, is actually a client of the API. And so using the API, you can get really early into the project lifecycle. So, for instance, we have some community developers have created node modules, grunt plugins, gulp plugins, that sort of thing to get really, really early in the development lifecycle. And if you can get as early as possible in there, you can avoid the bugs rather than having to deal with them after the fact.
So is this API all hosted on the cloud? So the reason I ask is because for Deloitte Digital, sometimes there would be projects that we do a lot of projects for federal government and state government. Mm-hmm. So maybe they would not be happy if we're just going to put this thing up in the cloud that's going to give us information back about it. So is there any way to actually to run things on your own local machines? Are there plans for that?
So there's actually three kind of ways you can approach that, and it all depends on your company. One way is that you can actually send over source. So there's two parameters that you would include in your request: either the URL of the page, which obviously doesn't help if it's in behind a firewall, the final source of the page. So you can do that. Now the second option would be like doing like a secure tunnel, like using a service like ngrok or something like that to provide introspection. There still might be clients who don't like that idea, especially if you're in a highly regulated industry like finance or insurance. And then of course the third is an enterprise install. So we can actually ship the entire thing over to you. You guys can install it behind the firewall and then use directly like that.
So how does that work? Because I think you're doing that with Microsoft, right? Am I correct?
No, Microsoft actually, the Microsoft partnership is really interesting because they've worked with us to use this over the cloud. They created the Visual Studio plugin to use it over the cloud. Nice. So right now that's just how they use it. Now they're talking about doing that behind the firewall and discussing some of the options there. We have some other things in the works with Microsoft as well that can't talk about yet, but yeah. So the idea for a situation like that, for like an enterprise install, is basically we ship you containers, like Vagrant Doc or something like that, and then you just stand it up. You have your new API endpoint that all your internal people use, and then it's like having it. Otherwise, it's exactly like having it in the cloud, but obviously it's behind your firewall, and you use it that way.
Your very own personal cloud.
Exactly.
We jumped. I know we jumped ahead a little bit because we're pretty excited about it, but some listeners may not be so familiar with accessibility on the web and some of the history of that. We don't have to go too deep into the history, but could you just give a little synopsis of kind of like how accessibility has kind of evolved into what it is today?
Yeah, so the stories about how the accessibility has evolved is intrinsically tied to how the web has evolved. You know, a long time ago, for those of us who remember, you could get, you would use a computer with like a terminal interface, right? And so the accessibility challenges are pretty straightforward to deal with. You need to have access to that output. So the talking terminals would basically take that information that gets sent to standard output, shoot it through the speakers, bang, you have a talking terminal, a screen reader kind of thing. When we added the GUI interfaces that you would see on Windows machines or something like that, that created new challenges because the user had to see where the mouse pointer was or had to have the fine motor control in order to operate the mouse and to see where it's going. There was a product called JAWS. It's actually a pretty dominant screen reader now. JAWS for Windows was one of the first screen readers, or it may have been the first screen reader to work with a GUI. I don't really know that. But anyway, when Windows 95 got big and everything blew up with personal computers and the web and all that sort of perfect storm, JAWS came around to help close that gap. The internet has been an interesting challenge for people with disabilities because, the creation of like custom user interface controls and that sort of thing has always been a big challenge for people with disabilities, because standard HTML is ostensibly accessible by default, meaning if you use a text box or a checkbox or a radio button or a select or something like that, the HTML specification, the DOM specification, all that sort of stuff calls for that to be basically accessible by default. And then, of course, the browsers have to do their part in the whole thing. But the bottom line is it should be accessible by default. When you go to creating really like new custom interfaces, that's a big deal for accessibility, because if you're going to create like a tree menu or a tri-state checkbox or something like that that doesn't exist natively in the web, that's when people are going to use whatever they have at their disposal, divs and spans, and they're going to bind event handlers to that and all that sort of thing. And that's a big challenge for accessibility. Some of the new technologies, HTML5 and stuff like that, can help us bridge that gap if it's done right. But that puts the web developer on notice, like you have to do this the right way. And that's the challenge, is overcoming the ignorance problem and getting people to understand what accessibility is all about and how to do it.
I talked with Marcy Sutton a lot about this too when we were chatting on the episode with Steve Faulkner from Paciello Group as well. Mm-hmm. That a lot of times I'll hear from companies, well, we shouldn't worry about it. We'll put it in for last, like if we have to. Like accessibility, who cares if people can hear it? It's not really core to the feature.
Right.
But to me, and listening to like Jen Simmons has a lot of great episodes on accessibility on her podcast, The Web Ahead. Like hearing people talk about keyboard access, touch events, things that you don't really realize until you're working on multiple devices. That's even accessibility. Performance is part of that. Like, there's so many facets of this that it can be overwhelming for a developer. Mm-hmm. And when product puts it on a very, very low priority scale, mm-hmm. I found that it just gets swept under the rug. So how can we as developers change that, or should we change that?
See, I tend to think that's an atmosphere problem. For me, I view accessibility as a quality domain. There's sort of a couple aspects of it. It's there's the design aspect, there's the quality aspect, and then of course there's the civil rights aspect of it. And I feel like if we sort of care about quality, the other two sort of come along for the ride. If you're not making sure, for instance, that a control can work with spacebar and enter key and it works on click only, I think you're doing a bad job. You know what I mean? For me personally, I use a laptop all the time. I use that touchpad as little as I possibly can. And so if let's say I'm interacting with a form, and I click on, if I click the enter key on something that's supposed to progress me through the next portion of the interaction, and it doesn't work, I'm like, really? Like, how hard is that to bind the key down as well? So I think of it as a quality issue too. And my colleague at TPG, Billy Gregory, has a pretty interesting talk that he gives sometimes about, for lack of a better word, sort of guerrilla accessibility. Like, he just did it. You know what I mean? And I think if you just do it, it's going to help. And if you sort of try to mentor people and try to treat accessibility as a challenge, like that lets us pull in our creativity. It's a different story than beating people over the head with accessibility. I don't think that works. So at an organization where they say, oh, that we don't care, blah blah blah, I think the biggest challenge to overcome is ignorance. People need to understand why it's part of doing a good job, really, and not necessarily so much why it's important. That it is really important, but I think if somebody's going to argue the importance factor, they're kind of just a jerk. I mean, that's really the case. Don't tell me that, oh, how many people who use our website are mobility impaired. Guess what, dude? It doesn't matter. Are you going to say how many people who use our website are black? Is that going to be your argument? Well, our audience really isn't African Americans, so F them. You can't do that, and you can't do that with people with disabilities. So just assume that argument is done for, and work it from doing a good job.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I've been trying to figure out ways to incorporate it into process, and something that's a big challenge, because if you can demonstrate to product manager that, hey, this won't be much effort, and if you train new people to do this correctly, that it won't be an issue. It won't be a chore at the end.
Yeah.
It won't be something that people dread doing.
Yeah.
And like those people who don't do it in their applications because they don't need to, or whatever, their user base is not covering that. Well, they're wrong. There's always going to be a few people. Yeah. Right? I mean, I've experienced that where somebody, even like, it happens a lot too, where somebody up on high will say, well, I tried to swipe this, or I tried to press enter and it didn't work. And then the bug gets prioritized. So you have like a whole bunch more overhead at the end. So you pay now or you pay later is that idea. And you talk about this in your talk on tenon.io too, where you explain what you're building out there. And people can go check that out. It's great. Warning, lots of language in there. So if you're listening, it is a great talk though. Yeah. But just warn you guys. But you talk about something that was really interesting to me, was integration and not separation.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so that's the really important thing and I've been doing accessibility for like a decade now, and I've worked with, alongside, or in competition with other tool vendors, and what I find is that having a separate tool, having a separate process, having a separate QA team even, causes accessibility to be separated, and as long as it's separated, it's going to seem like an extra step. It's going to seem like something else, and when you're already dealing with a deluge of other new feature requests, new projects, existing bugs on the main thing, when you're dealing with all that sort of stuff, and then you ask somebody to, oh yeah, by the way, do accessibility, that's extremely demotivating, and that's probably the number one reason why I created Tenon was, imagine you're in your standard project that you're working in your IDE, whether it's Eclipse or Visual Studio or IntelliJ or whatever it is, and you have you're probably, at least I hope, going to have at least linting going on, some sort of pre-processing of stuff, unit tests or whatever. If we can get accessibility now in that process, that same standard developer process, it becomes integrated. It becomes something that you're just doing. It's also, I I don't really like the term gamification, but I think it does become a little bit on the gamification kind of thing where as you're working, let's say you have a grunt watch task, and as you're working and you save a file, it runs your tasks and then says, hey, you got these accessibility issues. Cool, I'll fix that now. Bang, and it's done. Rather than the whole end of the thing like, oh yeah, I forgot to do my accessibility testing. Maybe next time. It doesn't do that.
Especially with a lot of the very small things like adding alt tags to your images and things like that. If something can catch those there, then
Yeah.
it's much, like you said, it's a much less of a chore to go back and redo it.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're not going to catch everything. Like that's the one thing, and there's this sort of dichotomy in the accessibility community where they want to say don't use automated tools because it's not enough, and then the other people who are like, oh, I love it. Like we got to meet somewhere, and one of the places we can meet is just understanding. Automated accessibility testing is not going to get you all the way there, but in terms of high volume and high impact stuff, automated testing is going to get you pretty far down the road, and then you can have like accessibility SMEs on your team, or do user testing or something like that to find the stuff that automated testing can't. But there's a huge volume, probably about an average of 50, depending on the day, between 50 and 70 issues per page post deployment that you could have avoided in the first place.
So just on that, so I think that gave us quite a good clarity for anyone who's listening who's new to accessibility. So now for developers who have been doing it for quite a while, coming back to exactly this point, I think simple things like figuring out if alt tags was mixed, or if the validation of the page is there or not. Tools are there. Tenon, I love the APIs approach they have done. But there are other tools as well, and this is something that can be achieved. What my struggle has been, and it might be a struggle for other accessibility developers as well, like whenever we do something, I like to automate stuff moving forward, so I can have this continuous deployment in my products. I can do quick turnarounds and all of that stuff. Now in order for that to happen, I don't mind putting my resources as a product owner, putting my resources from a testing perspective to write automated test cases specifically for my product. Can I take a similar approach to accessibility as well? I understand I can use the tools and not everything can be automated. But if I have specific test cases that I can put in the effort to write some automated test cases, can I do that? Is there any plan intended to kind of help the developers with that?
So there's a couple of ways that you can do that, and I fully agree, especially when it comes to interactive stuff. Right now with Tenon, what you can do, let's say you're running some acceptance tests with Selenium or something like that. You can set it up so that at some point in time, Selenium sends a request to Tenon. So you can trigger your action, modify the DOM, grab the outer HTML node of the stuff that's changed and shoot that to Tenon by itself as a fragment. So you can do that right now. There's still going to be some things that that would probably benefit more from just straight up BDD style acceptance tests, like using something like Mocha or Chai or something like that, where you're let's say you take let's say you're doing a unit test on a modal dialog, right? So you're gonna do whatever fires the event to launch the dialog, and then when that dialog appears, you want to write those unit tests to explicitly test for is the dialog like the first actionable item in the dialog the first thing that gets focused. So you're going to want to explicitly check for that focus state, check for tab index equals 0 on all the underlying stuff. There's lots of very specific testing that I think people should write as well. And matter of fact, if I recall correctly, Marcy's done some of that with Angular, where some of the very specific interaction that they have going on in unit testing of Angular, Marcy's done that, and I think that's a good way to close that gap.
Right. That's definitely an interesting approach, and that I guess closes the gap to some extent.
Yeah, and some of the other things you can do is test for, changes to focus state in terms of programmatic and visual changes and stuff. I don't see why we can't get that far down the road. It's kind of easy to go down a rabbit hole with some of those, but the really core interactions of a system, we're already doing acceptance tests on those anyway. We should add some special accessibility tests too.
Yeah. So in terms of what Tenant provides us, like I've used Tenant for a bit as well. I actually had some interaction with you over email as well. But one of the things that I still probably everyone would benefit is how deep does Tenant check for? Like how does it actually test for something? Is that something you can talk about? Is it like, do you do a headless browser? Do you do a real browser? What do you actually check for when something is passed to Tenant?
So one of the really important things for accessibility testing is to make sure that we test the page in the state that it's going to be when the user interacts with it. So any tool that tests just static HTML without rendering the JavaScript and CSS is not testing what the user experiences. And this is due to how assistive technologies work. First off, not everybody who's disabled uses a screen reader, so that's the important thing to keep in mind. They're going to use the same browsers as we do. The other thing that some who are new to accessibility don't realize is that screen readers are not browsers. They're an application that gets their information from the browser. So the browser requests the page. The server responds with the page. The browser renders that DOM. It gets all the assets, renders the DOM, and then the accessibility API feeds the necessary object information to the screen reader. So we need to test it. We need to test the page after the CSS, images, all that sort of stuff has taken their effect on the page. So Tenant does use a headless browser and tests after the page has loaded. We don't test on DOM ready either. So that actually happens to be one of the challenges that we see with people who don't get good, they don't get results, or like they get a 522. If you ever get a 522 out of Tenant, it's because you have some sort of third-party thing, like a widget or like a Twitter widget or something that doesn't finish loading, because we have to wait for the load event. And one of the things we're going to do next to fix that is just like force the load event after a certain period of time.
That's good to know.
Yeah. So on that note too, with if somebody has a custom element that they've created and they've added I guess some accessibility to that. Well, I guess we can talk a little bit about ARIA and semantics and things like that after. But if somebody had done that and they passed that to Tenant, will Tenant recognize that at that point if it is registered?
So you mean like a component?
Yeah, like a web component custom element. Yeah.
So this is like the next challenge for accessibility testing tools in general, because of the encapsulation of web components and the shadow DOM, you can't get access outside of that element to the guts of it. So we're having a challenge with that right now, where we need to figure out how to get into that. I'd like to see, because web components, they have sort of, like the web in general, right? You have, if you're used to like object-oriented programming, like PHP or Java, you have protected, public, and private. Well, so in a web component, everything is private. So there's no ability to get inside of that thing unless the web component author creates that way to get into it, and we don't have that yet.
Well, even like shadow DOM aside, I know like Xtag, for instance, does not use the shadow DOM.
Mm-hmm.
So you could pass right through that into that. Will it recognize the semantics and will it recognize, any the ARIA type of things because it's a custom element, or does it only? Do you have like a white list of, hey, these are the HTML5 elements? We can't really parse every custom type of thing that's passed in here.
Well, one of the things we're doing this quarter is focusing on that, doing ARIA validation. And so, for instance, we're working on code right now that will test stuff based on their computed role. So ARIA allows you to set roles for certain things. So, and if it's ARIA, if a role is derived from ARIA, then we'll be doing testing on does it have the right roles and states and properties, and are they within boundaries? You know, because some of the roles are true false, some of them are token lists, blah blah blah.
Mhm.
So we're working on that right now. It's currently not in place.
So a lot of, on the note of ARIA and semantics in general, like looking at the W3C docs and the documentation on a lot of this stuff,
Mhm.
it's really meant for not developers, I guess, would be the best way to put it.
Mhm.
So when you read it, it's kind of like stereo instructions, as they used to say. So it can be very overwhelming to look at the roles and to look at the differences. And for those who don't know, I guess we should probably say, what is ARIA first off?
Mhm. So ARIA is it stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications, and it allows you to apply semantics that didn't already exist. So, for instance, there's no such thing as a tri-state checkbox in standard HTML. With ARIA, you can. You can give, like, let's say you had a list item, a role of checkbox. You could give that checkbox a state of unchecked, checked, or mixed, so on and so forth. You can use JavaScript to toggle those values and create basically an accessible control out of something that would normally not be accessible at all.
Right.
Yeah.
And so with ARIA too, there's a lot of things you can do with even things you wouldn't think that you could make accessible, like Canvas.
Mm-hmm.
Some things that developers may not think is accessible.
SVG.
Yes, SVG. There's some things though, like some people when they start and they look at accessibility and they see these docs and they say, "Oh my God, I can't deal with this. I need some help. I'm going to call the Paciello group and have Karl or Steve or somebody come and help me."
Yeah.
What are the tools that developers can do, not necessarily to do what Tenon does, but just to understand, well, all right, I think I should add this type of role here, or because this is using Ajax, I should probably have this type of ARIA.
Yeah. It's a challenge. So a little bit of a shameless plug. I have a website called Karl Groves -sandbox.com, KarlGroves -sandbox.com, and there's an ARIA cheat sheet on there that can help a little bit. Other than that, finding information is pretty difficult. Now there's the Open Ajax Alliance has some examples. They're dog ugly, but man, they're pretty good prototypes for showing stuff. There was a book done. The guys from the Filament Group did a book called Designing with Progressive Enhancement, and it's a progressive enhancement book. But what's really cool about it is it has lots of ARIA stuff in it. Now I don't know if it's been updated lately or anything like that, but James Craig from Apple, who was one of the co-authors of the ARIA spec, was a technical reviewer on the book, and he provided some good information. Other than that, it's sad because there's no other books out there, as far as I understand, on ARIA. A guy named Hayden Pickering created a book that's published by Smashing, Accessible Web Applications, I think is what it's called. So that's got some ARIA in it, but nobody, book publishers aren't interested in this kind of stuff. Saying
not as sexy as Virtual DOM, right?
Exactly, yeah. I'm going to throw some attributes on it. That's not anywhere near as sexy as people would like to be. So it's really hard. And like you said, yeah, I mean, W3C specifications in general are great if you have insomnia.
And they're very useful for their audience, I'm sure. But
yeah, absolutely.
The audience is not developers.
Yeah, and so they, I happen to think actually that the ARIA spec is actually pretty good. There's the ARIA, what is it called? ARIA design patterns, which is pretty good if you're going to dive into it and start reading it. But still, like, working examples, I think, are what people learn from, at least for me. And I'd like to see some more beneficial stuff.
Also, if you go to the developer.mozilla.org, they have some sections where they have some pretty decent stuff. A lot of them are pretty basic examples, but for example, we're talking about role, and so like they have an example of like, all right, here's a span that we're using as a button for some reason, and they tell you how to set it up. So like they add the role of button, they add the tab index of 0, and they add the on-click handler and the on-key up handler, so that you just kind of an example, like, okay, here's this one thing, this one small example, fully fleshed out, and this is how it will work. One other thing I wanted to make sure we brought up as well is, so like ARIA stuff is great, but I think it was when we had Steve on as well that at a certain point, just if you can, use the element for what it's for.
Yeah.
So if you can use a button and style that button to look whatever, use the button, and it will make your life a little bit easier because it's already a button. You don't have to tell. You don't have to use ARIA to tell something that it is a button. So that's part of it as well. So part of it is ARIA and understanding all of these different things, and part of it is just use a link for a link, use a button for a button, and that will help make some of your life a little bit easier. Like, and using forms, because if you use form and you have a submit button, when you hit enter, that form will submit. So just things like that as well, that if you adhere to them, you don't have to go into some of this other stuff.
Yeah, Billy Gregory and I did a presentation at CSUN this past week, and the presentation was titled Why ARIA, which is play on words, WHY ARIA, in which we go through some of the roles, like roll of button, roll of link, roll of heading, that sort of thing, which are like, why would we use that? Like, you can totally style all of those things as you need. There's literally no reason to do that in the HTML context. But what a lot of people forget is that that way ARIA is meant to be a bridging technology to create accessibility for anything. So SVG, right? There's no such thing as a button in SVG. You can create an SVG element, give it a roll of button, do all the other stuff we just talked about, and that's cool. But like, roll of heading, we can style that, Role of group, we can have a field set, that sort of thing. So you're right, using the regular HTML in cases where we can do it and we can style it, to get your accessibility for free in that case too.
Yeah, it's like building, like when you're in building with iOS, if anyone's familiar, like you have like a keyboard, right? That you can add in, but you can make your own custom keyboard, right? But that keyboard, if you make it an object that's not a keyboard, not a custom keyboard, but just a like an arbitrary object that you're putting in, you're not going to get all that internal accessibility that's already built for you. So now you have to reinvent the wheel. So you're creating all of this work for yourself when you could have just used what was there and then modified it a little.
Yeah, you see that a lot too. Like, you used to see it a ton in Flash and Flex, or even Java, or even C++, where there would be like a perfectly fine class that you could extend, but people would still reinvent the wheel, and you're like, no, don't create a new object just because you don't like the way the one thing looks. Extend it, override it, and move on. That's what I like about web components. There's this controversy right now with web components where they think that the is syntax is icky or whatever, but the cool thing about is it is the extensible web, right? And in our presentation, the presentation I did with Alice Boxall at CSUN, there's a great example that Alice has created, which is she's got three instances of checkboxes and radio buttons: the completely custom one, the extended one, and then the standard one. And the extended one's cool because it looks exactly like whatever you want it to look like, but it extends the input type of radio to do what it's got to do, and so it exposes all the necessary accessibility information, and it's progressive enhancement, right? Because if you're not on Chrome and you're on Safari or something like that has pretty bad web component support, you get the fallback as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of that starts from CSS, where web developers look at it and they go, oh, forms and all this stuff. I can't deal with CSS and working with these things because it won't work across browsers. So whatever, I'm just going to make a div. So I mean, you look at all of the older jQuery plugins I used to use, and I'm guilty of it myself.
That's exactly what I was going to say. We're talking like
we've done that.
Yeah,
I will totally say I am a guilty party. So when it comes to that, I agree with you, Danny.
just to take the conversation back to Tenon a bit, because
Yeah.
I'm still interested a lot in the tool.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
I've been so yeah. I
We should have
think
a
I
show on
started
that.
using Tenon in about just end of last year,
Hmm.
so in December. So I've been keeping track. So like some of our clients at 3 have been asking about Tenon as well. And should we start using it? Would you recommend it? And yes, they're like, we are using it right now. Would we suddenly roll it out to all our customers? We still want to test it out on our own first.
Hmm.
But one of the key things that I keep hearing was there are a lot of cool features. So the idea behind Tenon is great.
Hmm.
And my first question, how do you say it? Is it Tenon or how do you say it?
I say tenon, yeah.
Yeah, all right. So that's clear. So the idea is brilliant. But there seems to be a lot of features that is still in the pipeline, like the ARIA support and some of the other pieces. So for the sake of speeding things up, is it just a core team internally you guys are working on? Is there a plan to open source some piece? Are you open to taking any help from outside? Anyone who's listening? Any thoughts on that?
It's really interesting. So far it's just me and Asa Bayless, and we have a server guy that we pay as a subcontractor, and we have a node developer that we pay for some additional help recently on a new feature I can't announce yet. But so that's it, and so we're limited really by our time and our money. We're completely bootstrapped. We have absolutely no investors whatsoever. We're not like chasing down VC money or anything. So that's sort of a problem. If I could beg for money, that would be great.
How about a nice
How long do I have?
donate button on your site, though?
A what?
You should put a donate button on your site, though.
It's actually called subscribe. It's in the upper.
Oh, that's what that is. I thought I was going to get an email update.
Pricing, yeah. So we actually do have some people who have been purchasing lately, or who are buying annual plans, which is great because that's bought me about 2 hours of my lawyer's time on some patents that we're working on. But yeah, for one thing, we do want to support the open source ecosystem. Lots of people who've done stuff like all the Grunt plugins, the node modules, the protractor stuff, that's all been open source, and we want to support anybody who wants to do that. As a matter of fact, if you're doing something big like any of that stuff, I will give you a free license to Tenon to create some of these other things. Like what I'd love to see, a tiny MCE or CK editor plugin would be awesome, so that the content people can check their work too.
Would someone like to create a plugin for WebStorm, please? Anybody?
Yes,
Yeah.
WebStorm, absolutely. If it works in, as long as it works in PHP Storm and WebStorm and IntelliJ, that would be even better.
Yeah.
They usually work across.
Yeah. Sublime Text, Eclipse, any of that sort of stuff anybody wants to create, that would be awesome. And we will also promote the crap out of it, like we've been doing with the Visual Studio plugin that Microsoft created. And we're hoping we have some things in the works with other people who are going to probably be giving us money for an enterprise license, and we're going to reinvest all of that money too. But if anybody wants to help, I can't pay right now, so there's that.
Just accept the fact you're not going to get paid, but it would be
yeah, exactly. We're not getting paid either, so it's fair. Yeah, so we'll take any help we can get, and even as simple as telling me about bugs or new features that you want to see, that's fine too.
Oh, we can tell you about bugs. that we could do.
Yeah. So one thing though, you might consider, I don't know, like I recently saw a couple of videos from the guys at Netflix, particularly Jafar Hussain, who's a fantastic speaker, and he was talking about how Netflix has this project called Gibbon, and that's something that somebody asked me, oh, is it going to be open source? And he said, well, that's sort of our bread and butter, so we're not open sourcing that. But what they've done is they have that. That's their core business. They can't get rid of that. But they have all these other things that they've actually open sourced, which are pieces of that ecosystem that you can use in any applications.
Yeah.
So like things like that where people can help you with the this is core to my business work as open source
Right.
might be a nice approach. I don't know
Yeah.
what the business model is. So
Yeah,
but
that's how we see it. We see our actual product as the API. So that's what we sell. And when so people subscribe, they get the web interface. The web interface is cool, but even the web interface is just a client of the API. And so if so we see the what we're selling is the API and the results and stuff like that. Anything else that we create around it is totally going to be open source. If we create it, or somebody creates it, or if we pay somebody to create it, it's all going to be open source, because that's what we totally believe in, supporting that. Because the more people who benefit from, let's say, the Grunt plugin or any of the other stuff that other people have made, I think the better everybody is. Because ultimately we care about solving the accessibility problem, or the biggest accessibility problem I see is code getting put into version control that's not accessible. And so to the extent that we can help other people do that, we want to do that too.
And
Just on that point of reaching to a state where you have this accessibility baked right into your development from day one, right? Probably as a editor plugin, I'm writing my code and I'm seeing issues in it. But for people, specifically enterprises, and I understand 10 and 1 enterprise clients, a lot of the struggles that I've seen with my clients has been, we want to do it, but for whatever X, Y, Z reason, we are at a state where it wasn't done before and we want to start now. We're fully behind it, but it's just that to get to a state where they can bake into the development, they need to fix some of the previous stuff that is already checked into version control.
Yeah.
And in order to do that, the biggest challenge is they always come back to us and say, can you assess our site and tell us our accessibility issues? And there's some great companies out there, including like the firm you are working for, as well as a few others who do this entire assessment of it. Though a lot of times I feel if a lot of things that are simple can just be automated, like Tenant is there in terms of API, and the pieces we were just talking about in the ecosystem. One great piece that I have always felt the need of is a website crawler that can go to a link, crawl everything, send it to Tenant API, and tell me an assessment of the entire site. Is there any of this crawler that you have spoken to any of your guys in the ecosystem? Is anyone building such a thing?
I guess I should let the cat out of the bag, that we have.
yes,
we have a spider. We're
Nice.
working on the UI for it right now. This spider is lightning fast. It's also as part of the way we architect things, it's also a client of the API. So as it crawls, it's shooting those things to the API itself. And so it's actually been done for about a month now. But we had other launch-related things to do, and also we need to work out the UI for that. The interaction of creating something that has so many options behind it is it's been interesting from a design challenge. And luckily, I'm not the one designing it because I suck at design. So that should be out pretty soon, actually.
So
Let me know as soon as I got 3 enterprise clients lined up exactly for it.
Woohoo! I'm gonna take you out to dinner. I'll fly to India to take you out to dinner when you get done.
I was going to say, I guess it was worth coming on the podcast for that.
Yeah.
So there's one thing too with I feel a lot of Adi's pain as well, but I don't have as many of the projects that Adi takes on. He has a very big role over in India, and he does a lot of that work. But I could see for a lot of clients though that it could be as easy to suggest to them that, hey, moving forward, everything should be done with Tenon. And every time we go into a feature to do something or change something, we should do that.
Yeah.
Like the clean campfire idea.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that phrasing, the clean campfire idea, because that's exactly how I like to approach things too. and I think the other thing to keep in mind is I feel like, automated testing should be, even if you're in that scenario where you want to do an audit, like you want to hire somebody to do an audit or something like that, try doing some automated testing first, mostly because the people at TPG or any of the other consulting firms, I don't want to focus too much on TPG, but TPG,
We're
there's
fans.
stuff, huh?
We're fans.
Yeah, they're specialists. They're super smart, really great at finding all this sort of stuff. And so if you can get a lot of that automated stuff out of the way first, you'd be doing yourself a ton of favors too, because it's easy. I've seen some instances where we've done audits on stuff where the volume of errors, especially on like sort of legacy web applications, business intelligence kind of things, the volume of errors is so high that it becomes noise when we're trying to do testing. Because when I do a manual test, I literally look at every line of code on every page that I'm testing to make sure I haven't missed anything, that sort of thing. Then I get at it with assistive technology and keyboard access and stuff like that. And sometimes some of these things are so bad that it's sort of difficult to get through to really find all the other stuff that, say, an automated tool couldn't find.
So can Tenon handle looking at media, like videos or audio, or even Canvas SVG? Can it give all the information about that?
Well, no. So anything that's like compiled like that, like a Java applet or Flash files or any media stuff like that, that's going to be sort of a black box. And this is where you get into false positives with other tests, right? So one of Tenon's philosophies is, I'm never going to tell you something. I'm never going to give you an error about something I haven't detected. That doesn't mean I'm 100% right. I'm not going to tell you that that Tenon finds everything, or that everything Tenon finds is spot on. But I remember one time I was looking through the source code for an open source tool, and just by having the HTML5 video element or the HTML5 audio element, this tool would give you 16 issues. And it was stuff like, make sure you have captioning, make sure you have a transcript, all that sort of stuff. That's fine. That's good information for somebody to be aware of. But I don't want to, if I can't tell you don't have something, then I'm not going to tell you about it. I'm not going to give a bunch of issues, 16 extra issues per page that you don't need to know about.
Right.
And so that's.
Can you configure it and like flag it like more for as a this object is not defined, like something like that?
So what we do is there's a parameter for the API when you submit your request called certainty, and it takes a numeric string from 0. It's going to have to be 0, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. And what it does is you tell me what certainty you want, and then I only give you those things that I'm certain that amount or above. So something like that we were just talking about, I can say, oh, I've seen this video element and I noticed that there's no track elements in it. I'm going to tell you with 20, 40% certainty that you're going to have to look at it. But I don't want to give that something like 80 or 100, because you could have your captions as part of the video. You could have you could have your transcript associated with it somehow. You could have live audio description in there that I don't know about. And so I don't want to give too high of a certainty to something I consider a maybe.
So do you think that or not do you think, but there is no way then to say, all right, we use images in this way, so just because we don't have an alt tag, we don't want you to actually see that. That's probably a bad example because you always want an alt tag, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Where could you say this particular rule, ignore?
The same way you can with a linter, where you can set, when you get those, possible strict violations and stuff like that, where you're like, okay, well, I know this is correct, so you can kind of mark it saying, like, I know what I'm doing here. I'm manual looking here and making it pass. Can you do the same type of things with Tenon?
So I think, if I'm not mistaken, Andrew Bababian's grunt plugin. Andrew works for Razorfish, and he created one of the first grunt plugins. And I think he's added a filter, and the filter is going to be all the test IDs that you want to ignore. And so it's just you add an array of those, and it'll ignore it. It's something actually we've been thinking about doing on our end, but I think it's either Andrew or Ed. One of their grunt plugins does what you're talking about.
Cool.
And if it was open source, we could roll it back in.
Yeah, exactly.
So for the segue here, for continuous integration, continuous delivery, are there any concerns or things that we should consider when testing these sort of things with Tenon?
Yeah, so the one thing you don't want to do, remember I was just talking about that certainty score. If you're doing a CI, you don't want to turn your builds red for one of those things that are maybes. So in the linting scenario, I would pull that certainty score down, because I want to know about more. When I'm doing a CI kind of thing, I would want to put that certainty score pretty high, like 80%, 100%, and then run it that way. And so you sort of get both approaches. Your build's going to turn red if we found something definite. That's the one thing I would do.
Okay. And if people need help with some of the API, are there docs on the site, or is there like a man page for the CLI?
So we have, if you go to tenon.io, there will be a link at the top called Docs. That should have all the API documentation, all the information on how to understand reports, that sort of thing. If anybody has any questions that go beyond that, you can go to support.tenon.io. There's a sparsely populated knowledge base there right now, but people can ask questions, and typically either I will or Asa will answer them, or they can just email support@tenon.io, and we'll just provide the direct support there.
And a nice setup for you here. So are there any examples out there of integrations with React, Angular, or Ember?
So actually, so Marcy Sutton created a plugin to Protractor that uses Tenon, and that's really awesome. I'd like to see Ember and React do the same thing. Hint, hint for anybody out there. But yeah, Marcy's done a bang-up job.
That's awesome. And I also noticed on Bitbucket you have a React example. Is that usable? I haven't tested it myself, so.
So when we basically last year we built what has now become the test now page. So if you go to tenon.io and you run a test, you'll be able to test basically what is a React application that uses the Tenon API. That one that you see on Bitbucket it's a React-based form and UI, and submits the request asynchronously and stuff like that. So if you wanted to have your own basically Tenon demo page, you could use that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Adi, Danny, do you guys have anything outstanding that we didn't talk about?
Not at the moment. I'm very impressed with Tenon. I think it's one of those, we were talking about getting people to buy into something, and kind of the ability to then just run something quickly and be like, look at everything that's wrong, or something like that. I think it's very easy, much easier to put numbers to that. Mm-hmm. So I'm very impressed. I like a lot of the work you guys are doing. Yeah, and that's it. I'm gonna see if we can start integrating it into some of our build systems and stacks and things of that nature.
Awesome. So, and if you do it and want to write a blog post, I'd love to have it.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Joe Watkins wrote a really awesome blog post about using the Grunt plugin that Ed created. It's great. He's got screen captures and videos and all that sort of stuff. I think that'll help people get past the idea of, oh, it's a cool API, now what do I do? Those kind of tutorials would be great.
Awesome.
Well, it's very easy to wrap your head around right away, as opposed to reading through W3C docs. So, thank you.
Thank you.
And just on that note, one last thing, like again, I love Tenon as well, but I understand there are about 750 subscribers so far of it. Is there any way that do you have some case studies, or is there a list of people who are using it? So just so I can put confidence in my clients saying, hey, these are the guys using it.
You know what? I don't want to mention them, but I should start asking people, because there are people at pretty huge places that are using it. A lot of them said, you can't use our logo, whatever, and that's fine. But I should ask if I could at least mention them. So
yeah, that would be great. If you can put that in Tenon, that would be a huge benefit for all of us.
Yeah, it's very helpful to show that to clients for sure. At least here at 3Pillar.
Our competitors are using it.
Well, thanks, Karl. We really appreciate you coming on. I know we're a couple minutes over, so I'm going to wrap it up. But you've been awesome. Thank you for educating us on web accessibility and Tenon. It's a great project.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
All right, bye.
All right, it was good chatting.